Welcome back to another great episode of Rabbi Pinchas Winston's weekly webinar. We're here today. This is Josh Wander from Yerushalayim. Rabbi Winston is joining us from Telstone, and we have a special today. It is called To Become a Great Leader. And I will, just before we start, I will encourage everyone to go and visit Rabbi Winston's website. Let me just show you that. That website is at 36.org. You can see it here. There you can find all of his webinars, his projects, his books. You could purchase his books there. So I encourage everybody to go over there. And I also would encourage everybody to visit another website called bringthemhome.org.il. You can also visit it at israeltorah.org.il. And that also includes a YouTube channel, which I encourage everybody to go to, Israel Torah. There you can sign up, you can subscribe, you can hit the bell for notifications. And there we have dozens and dozens of classes, of lectures from different rabbis and rebbitzins speaking about the idea of the ingathering of the exiles and Eretz Yisrael. And with no further ado, I will allow Rabbi Winston to take over. Thank you, Rabbi Winston.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks. We are holding now right in Parshas Noach, the second parsha of the Sefer Bereshis, the book of Genesis, and it moves very quickly. Once we begin all over again with Simchat Torah, we celebrate the fact that we have Torah and the joy that it gives to us, and it certainly does, tremendous. And we start all over again. And even though we had a full week this time, because sometimes Simchat Torah can happen in the middle of the week, and you only have 2-3 days, maybe just one day sometimes before you have to read the parsha, weekly reading of Bereshit, and you move on. But this week, this year actually was very nice because we had a full week because Simchat Torah fell on Shabbat, and as a result of that, we didn't read Parshas Bereshit until the following week. So we had a whole week to look at it, but it's already moved on. Now we're already holding it in Parshas Noach, and of course the story of the flood. The parsha starts off and says the following thing after. The last thing that God said at the end of the parsha was that the Torah itself said that Noach matzeh chen bein Hashem, meaning that Noach, he was safe in the flood because of the fact that he had chen, this thing called chen. And if anybody wants to know exactly what that is and how it's tied to Hanukkah, they can join a webinar I'm doing right now on Tuesday evenings that talks about the whole concept of chen. But for the most part, it seems that it was a very important quality because of the fact that Noach was saved from the flood and his whole family because of it. And it starts off in this week's parsha saying, Eila told us Noach ish tzadik tamim. These are the generations of Noach. Noach was a righteous person, very pure and righteous person. Hayaba dorasav, in his generation. Es Elokim hisalech Noach. And Noach walked with God. And that seems very complimentary. That seems to be speaking very highly of Noach. But Rashi, the medieval commentator who speaks almost on every verse in the Chumash, explained to us and showing us important information that we need to understand in order to be able to appreciate what's actually being conveyed to us by the Torah, so we can apply it to our own personal lives. And he says the following thing. It's actually quoting the Talmud. It's actually the rabbis of the Talmud who are saying this. It says, Yesh me Rabosenu, it's going the word Badorosav, that he was a righteous person in his generation. Now, if it just said he was a righteous person, there'd be nothing to talk about, nothing to dispute. He's a righteous person. There's nothing being qualified over here. But once the Torah adds the words Badorosav, he was righteous in his generation. So at that point in time, the Talmud says, Yesh me Rabosenu Dorshim Osa L'Shavach. Some people say that this is meant to praise Noach, to speak highly of him, saying that in his generation, meaning what? Kol shekain she'ilu hayeh b'dor tzadikim. hayat tzadik yoter. Everyone knows how difficult it is to be righteous or just be good if you're amongst a bunch of bad people. If everyone around you is doing terrible stuff, it's very hard to be a righteous person. You tend to blend in. You tend to be afraid to stand out unless you're really strong in your determination to live up to the standards that you hold for yourself, and God holds for you as well if you believe, go that far with it. And even in spite of the fact that Noah's generation was so evil, doing terrible things, so godless, Noah stuck to his guns. He maintained his righteousness in spite of all of it. And that's a tremendous thing to say about something. It shows the principles that the person lives by and how important it is for them to be consistent with what they believe. They're not going to be a hypocrite. That's Noah over here. The yesh shedors and osleganai. Some people say it's just the opposite. It's actually the Torah saying, as righteous as he was, lefi doro hayat tzadik, relative to his generation, he was a righteous person. The ilu hayat b'daro shel Avram lo hayat nechshav leklum. But had Noah lived in the time of Abraham, they will overlap a little bit, but had he lived in that lifetime, then Noah wouldn't have counted for very much at all. His righteousness would not have seemed like righteousness, because the opposite is true as well. That a person thinks that they're a good person. In fact, we see this later on in the Chumash, when Lot is told to leave the city of stone, Sodom and Gomorrah, and God has had enough of them, and he wants to destroy the place, and that's where Lot, Abraham's nephew, has gone to live. And he's the righteous guy there because of the fact that everybody around him is so evil. And later on, when he's told by the angel to leave Sodom and go someplace else, he begs not to have to go back to Abraham, not to go back there. Why? Because there, amongst Abraham, he was the bad guy. He didn't look like anyone special compared to Abraham. He may have been okay compared to others, but compared to Abraham and the righteous camp, he didn't seem like much at all. So he said, don't force me to go back there, because then I'll feel like nobody once again, and my whole self-confidence will be under attack. So let me go someplace else where they're not so good, because at least in stone I look like the righteous person. Now the question is, you can fool yourself most of the time, you can fool your friends a lot of the time, but you can't fool God any of the time. But they're saying over here that Lot was righteous compared to everybody else around him, but compared to Abraham, who's going to come after him, he doesn't even hold a match to him, so to speak. So that's what it says over there. That's what the pasuk says. And the second half, or that's what the commentators say, and the second half of the verse, the same verse says, Es Elokim hisalech Noach, and Noach walked with God. Now, normally when you hear that term, someone walks with God, that sounds very complimentary. It sounds like a wonderfully special trait to be able to live by. If only I walked with God, that's a special, high, holy level to be living on. But again, Rashi, quoting the rabbis, says the following thing. It says, Uv Avraham hu omer asher hislachti lefanav. But by Abraham, when it talks about walking with God, it says instead that Abraham walked before God. So Noah walked with God, but Abraham walked before God. What's the difference? Is there a difference at all? So it says, right, that Noah haya tzarich sa'ad lesamcho. Noah required support. He required, somebody to help him out. In this case, it was God, but he required that inspiration. If he didn't get it, he didn't do it. Seemingly, that's what it's saying. Aval Avraham haya mischazek umahalech betzidko me'alav. But Avraham, he did on his own. He didn't wait for anybody. He saw what the reality was. He saw what had to happen. He saw what he had to be. He looked at the world. There's a whole story about Avram Avinu, how even from the age of 3, he was already exhibiting, tremendous character and the trait of truth. He rejected idol worship, even though his father himself was one of the chief idol makers. famous story of Abraham going there. He was asked by his father to mind the store while his father went out. And he did. And while he minded the store, right, he went ahead and smashed the idols and put the hammer in one of the idol's hands. And when his father came back and he said, "What happened?" And Abraham said, "Well, they got jealous and the whole fight broke out. And that idol went ahead and smashed the other idols out of jealousy." And Terach, his father, turns to him and says, "Come on, they can't do that." So Abraham said, "If they can't do this, so why do you believe in it?" Clearly, it's just idols and stones. Eventually, Terach does tshuva. In fact, he does a lot of tshuva, but he dies, unfortunately, before he could finish his tshuva, his repentance. He goes with Avraham. We'll get to that later on, perhaps in future weeks. But eventually, Avraham is forced to leave Ur Kasdim, where he was, and go to Haran, eventually to Eretz Israel, Parshas Lech Lecha, and Terach accompanies him and dies along the way before he can do full tshuva. So the Arizal, the biggest Kabbalist in the last 500 years, revealed to us that he actually reincarnated to finish his repentance into Eov, otherwise known as Job, right? He reincarnated to finish the Job. That was the whole point of Eov's suffering. That's what it's called in Hebrew, Eov. Not just because of Eov has done something wrong. He questions why, and God says to him, "Well, it's a lot deeper than you think. It's more beyond the surface." And one of the reasons why is because it was Terach finishing off his repentance. But Abraham, he was a trailblazer, and it almost cost him his life. In fact, if it wasn't for a miracle, he wouldn't have been saved, because Nimrod, who was the leader of the generation for the bad guys, he was the one who caused everybody to rebel against God, the Talmud says. That's why his name is Nimrod, comes from the word mored, to rebel. And he convinced everybody to build the Tower of Babel and rebel against God. So that was a leader on the wrong side of the line. He was a great leader for bad. You can call that great, but it means that he really put himself into it, and he put himself out. It was very important to him. Just unfortunately, it was for all the wrong reasons and all the wrong things, and eventually he is undermined by Kodesh Baruch Hu himself, by God himself. But Avraham was a trailblazer for good, and when Nimrod heard about Avraham, who was trying to undermine idol worship, which was hugely important at that time, especially for the kings, because the kings painted themselves as gods. So if you're going to say that idol worship has no meaning, you're basically taking all these secular leaders who are pretty evil in their own right and doing whatever they want, pillaging the world, and you're making them into human beings once again. That just didn't fly with Nimrod. So he took Avram and he put him into some kind of cauldron of fire, expecting him to burn alive. He asked him, "You want to change? You want to change your mind and become an idol worshiper, or at least back off from your opinion about the entire thing?" And everyone says, "No, sorry. If I have to die, I have to die." And then a miracle happens, and everyone sees the miracle, and because of that, a lot of people convert to Abraham's way of life, because they see that God is real and God is true. But Avraham did all of this on his own. He took all the risks. Noah didn't do that. Noah required some type of divine providence to help him out. And this distinguishing factor is something that's so central, even though we don't really dwell on it much in the Parsha, and most people don't get up and talk about it so much. But in a sense, these beginning Parshas are telling us why we were created and what our mission in life has to be. And to gloss over it is to miss out on such an important opportunity to be able to develop yourself and to become the ultimate thing we're here to become. And that is a partner, a shutaf, a partner with God in the completion of creation. God made everything. He put it all together. He provides it all, sustains it, maintains it. But he left over something that we should be able to use our free will to participate in the perfection of ourselves and our communities and the world, and eventually the entire universe. That's man's job. And you can do it one of two ways. You can either actively and proactively do it, or you can do it passively, meaning it happens through you instead, in which case you don't know it's even happening through you, and you lose out on the chance to get any reward for it because you're not willing it in any way, and you miss out on a fantastic and very important part of your own personal development. So this parsha is pointing it out and saying this is a major distinction between Avraham and Noach. And if a person understands that, if a person realizes that you just don't sit back and wait for things to happen, you have to take initiative. So how many people here feel that they have leadership qualities and they use them? Let's see, show of hands. One, just kidding, can't see you. But check it out. Ask yourself the question: am I a leader? Do I have leadership qualities, or am I just passive? It's like a movie set. You've got the main actors. There might be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 who get all the attention and all the money too, for that matter, and everybody else walking around in the background. Is that what you want to be? Someone else walking around in the background? That's the way that billions of people have lived their lives now for thousands of years, and only a few people have risen to the top to be able to make a significant impact on all of creation, all of history. For example, Moses, right? Moshe Rabbeinu. That's what we call him in Hebrew. His name is Moses in English, right? But he's called Moshe Rabbeinu. The Hebrew name is Moshe Rabbeinu, means our teacher. Now, before he became the great leader that he ultimately became, leading the Jewish people not just out of Egypt, but also to Mount Sinai and through the desert for 40 years, up to the land of Eretz Israel, and to this very day, it's called Torah Moshe. The Torah that we have, that we learn, that we live our lives by, basically, is called Torah Moshe, in his name, because of the impact it had. And he had such a leadership drive. Now, we'll have to see what that means, because it's not like he was so conscious. He was driven by some internal force and belief that made him do what he did. So, for example, a very interesting and curious story takes place in Parsha Shmos, when God is looking to anoint him as the leader of the Jewish people, so to speak, and to put him in charge of the redemption. So at that point, Moshe is just the son-in-law of Yisro, and he's tending the sheep and biding his time there. Whatever he's doing spiritually, developing, growing, and all that, that's Moshe Rabbeinu. But is that a mission per se? He knows what's going on back in Egypt because he was there. He was raised there. He saw what happened. He was forced to run for his life when he killed the Egyptian, even though he was acting as an Egyptian himself because he was being raised in Pharaoh's court. And he was going out into the fields, not like a Jew who was suffering and building, but as a Jew who was being treated like an Egyptian, as royalty. And despite the fact that it cost him his security, when he saw this Egyptian beating a Jew, basically, because of all kinds of terrible things this Egyptian was doing, then Moshe took charge. Didn't think of the consequences, or if he did, they didn't concern him. What concerned him was going on right now. So what did he do? He killed the Egyptian to stop him from beating the Jew. It was found out eventually, and as a result of it, he was forced to flee for his life, which he did for a long time until he came back around the age of 79, 80 to free the Jewish people. But where did it all begin? The mission itself. So you remember that the burning bush, that spectacular burning bush that the fire did not consume? A lot of depth, a lot of meaning. Why would God have to appear to Moshe that way? So it's interesting. In Kabbalah, there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of gematrias. There's a lot of things taking place, names of God. It's a very, very deep and complex part of Torah to study, but one certainly worthwhile looking at if you get the chance, because it shows you just how something so seemingly simple can be so incredibly complicated and instructive. But the verse itself, interestingly enough, it describes Moshe as he's walking by and he sees the bush burning, and he looks over and he sees that it's not being consumed. It's a curious spectacle to him, and he decides he's going to go over and take a look at what's going on and why it's not being consumed. So on one hand, What's the big deal? Wouldn't you? If you saw a bush burning that the fire was not consuming, wouldn't you wonder why that was the case and go check it out? Or just go on tending your sheep? So he checked it out. But the rabbis explained it was more than that. It wasn't just that he was checking to see why it was not being consumed by the fire, why it was not, being destroyed by the flames. It was more to do with the fact that he understood that if this thing is happening, then there must be something going on special in history, and I want to be a part of that. I don't know what it is. I have no idea what it's going to lead to, until God, in fact, speaks to him and calls him over, and he realizes this is a prophecy he's having right now. He's just going to find out what it is because he wants to know how it affects him, and how it affects his role, as a leader. In fact, all of Sefer Shmos, the entire book of Exodus, if you look at it very carefully, very closely, it's not so much about the Exodus. I mean, that's obviously the first part of it. We see that. It's Mitzrayim. That's what's called in Hebrew, the Exodus from Egypt. We start off with the names of the 12 tribes that went down to Egypt with their father Yaakov, and how they eventually, grew into a nation over there. And then Pharaoh decided he wants to destroy them, or at least put them to work first and then destroy them, in the process of working them. And then eventually Moshe rises and does the 10 plagues, and the Jewish people go out. But if you stand back and you look at the whole thing, basically you see that really it's not so much about the story of the Jewish people. That's there, but it's more like in the background. The story seems to be more about Moshe himself and his development. In fact, in all the books, we deviate somewhat from that story, that narrative of Moshe Rabbeinu, talk about sacrifices, because a lot of commandments we have to still learn about for all of us, without question. But overall, the book itself seems to be about Moshe Rabbeinu, a large part, and his development as a leader, which is maybe one of the reasons why it's called Torah Moshe in the end, because it's about him. And why is it about him? Because he was the quintessential leader. Avram started off that way, but we don't know a lot about Avraham. We don't know the same thing. The Midrash itself talks about Avram in detail, certain things, and tells us certain facts about his life and what he did, but not like it did with Moshe. But you don't have that type of dialogue taking place between Moshe and God, with Avraham and God, at least not that we know of. In fact, prophecy was much rarer in Avraham's time. They asked the question, for example, what's the big deal? Avram goes into a furnace and he doesn't burn to death. Okay, fine. It's a miracle, without question. It's a miracle. And other miracles, angels come to Avraham's house and predict he's going to have a son a year from then. There are certainly miracles taking place. Yaakov has miracles. Yitzchak has miracles, and we make a big deal about these miracles. But the rabbis ask the question, why do we make a big deal about these miracles? Because you look at the Gemara, in the time of the Tanaim, the rabbis who actually wrote the Mishnah, they were doing miracles left, right, and center. All over the place. Whatever they wanted, whatever they needed, they did a miracle. They were hungry. They used Kabbalah to produce some type of calf, a cow or something, And if they were in financial difficulty, they could produce money. They could change the decree of the Romans using Kabbalah. This is the reason why we read about them on Yom Kippur in the Musaf of the Yom Kippur service, right? The additional offering service that we do on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And it talks about the 10 martyrs. Very curious story. Why? Because the way the whole thing unfolds, the Caesar pulls together 10 great rabbis. The truth is that not all at the same time, but pulls together, we'll stick to the simple narrative for the time being. But this Caesar pulls together 10 of the greatest rabbis of that generation, including Rabbi Akiva, others, and he says to them, what is the punishment for kidnapping a fellow Jew? And they're referring to what the brothers did in Yosef's time, a few parshas from now. Yosef's brothers kidnapped him and sell him into slavery. We know that story. What's the punishment? Death. The Torah says that's culpable of a person's culpable of capital punishment. And the Caesars, the Roman Caesar, when was the last time a Roman Caesar required an excuse to kill off Jews? Even the leaders, they did it all the time. That was their pastime. That was their enjoyment. Yet this Caesar, for some reason, makes a story out of it. And he says, nobody until you has been able to fill the shoes of those great people back then who sold their brother into slavery. 10 brothers sold their brother Yosef into slavery. Binyamin was not part of it. And they were not punished. They never got death. Well, if they're supposed to get death, then God would have taken care of it. So why does a Caesar feel compelled to act on behalf of God? He doesn't. It's all a play. It's divine providence, ultimately, a story being told to all of us. And he says, therefore, I'm going to kill all of you in place of them. I'm going to do God a favor and finally punish kind of the perpetrators of that terrible act way back in Parshas Vayeshev. Now, that part's not unusual unto itself. What's even stranger is the reaction of these 10 rabbis. They turn to the Caesar and say, I'll tell you what, listen, we hear what you're saying, but before we go ahead with this plan of yours, we need to talk to the, up there, find out if this is decreed in heaven or what. We have to do it to die and go through all this? And the Caesar agrees. They give him 3 days, and Rav Yishmael Kohen Gadol, the high priest at that time, he uses Kabbalah to meditate on the name of God, goes into a higher realm, talks to Gabriel, and Gabriel tells him, yes, this is decreed in heaven, you have to go die and sanctify the name of God the best way possible. And the stories are heart-rending. And we read them on Yom Kippur, and who doesn't shed a tear reading those stories? But, what were these rabbis doing? How could they dare ask? This guy is probably a sociopath, and they're asking for permission to go talk to God to see what, if they have to die or not. And if they come back and they say God says no, the Caesar says, oh, okay, I didn't realize it. Now that I understand it, good. You go on your way. Sorry to bother you. He's going to kill them anyhow, except if you have the power to change the decree somehow, some way, as these rabbis were always doing at that time, because they knew Kabbalah, how to manipulate reality. But they only used it when they had permission to, or at least that was the best thing for history. They didn't simply use it to get out of trouble, personal trouble. That's not the way they were. They knew that everything has ripple effects. You do something, you use Kabbalah to change reality for the wrong reason, then it can have a very damaging effect on history. And they didn't want to do that. They were prepared to sacrifice their lives instead to damage the future of the Jewish people, the world itself. So if it had happened in such a way that God had said to them, no, you don't have to die. You can just do a simple sanctification of God's name. They could have used Kabbalah to change everything. But they didn't, because Gabriel said, no, history, for deep, important reasons, requires your deaths, sanctifying the name of God, and being the great leaders that they were, they did it. But the question remains, if they had that power to do that, so what was the big deal about Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in those days? So the Leshem, Rav Shlomo Eliashiv, who lived until 1926, the last century, and he explained, because it was a different period of history. In the time of the Second Temple, when we were living with tremendous, we call Hester Panim, the hiding of God's face. It was no longer a period of prophecy that was long gone. Divine providence was no longer so clear to the average person. Atheism was increasing. Agnosticism was increasing, or at least idol worship was certainly increasing at that time. And the world was moving further and further away from its path that it was meant to follow from the time of creation. And to survive it, the rabbis required the power of miracles, and therefore God gave it to them. He handed over to them, so to speak, the key to performing miracles. But Abraham didn't have that, and Yitzchak didn't have that, and Yaakov didn't have that, because that period of history didn't require that. So when miracles happen, they happen in a very, very big way. I mean, you had to really have a reason for that. In fact, the Medrash says that had it not been for the fact that Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, had to be born, and he's the grandson of Avraham, or Abraham, right? He's the grandson, then Avraham would have died that day in Ur Kasdim, in the cauldron of fire. But wait a second. He's right. He's sacrificing, for God. He's putting himself on the line for truth. He's taking a stand in the most important and meaningful way possible, and he's going to die? You're going to let him just going to die, God? Well, yeah, because if I don't, just take a look what's going to happen. People are going to choose to follow him, not because they came to the truth intellectually, like you're supposed to do, and they grew up emotionally, like you're supposed to. It's because they're going to be afraid. They're going to say, Avram was successful. Let's go with him. The guy making $1 million, he writes a book and everyone buys it because he made the $1 billion. So let's see how he did it. And God doesn't want that. God wants people to use their free will to choose morality because it makes sense to them. They've worked at the issues and important to them, and they choose that path for themselves. But in this case, Yaakov had to be born. So there was a tremendous and important need of history that Avram be saved by a miracle. So therefore God went ahead and performed the miracle, and he was not consumed by the fire and came out unscathed. And everybody was duly impressed and became a convert to the religion of Abraham, or at least not everyone, but certainly a lot of people. And you can imagine how angry and frustrated Nimrod himself must have been from all of this. And then Avram goes on his way with his father. But he was prepared to die. That's the whole thing. We find a similar story later on by the prophets, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. They were told by God that they have to they're going to take a stand and allow themselves to be burned to death to take that stand. So then a miracle's not going to happen for them. So don't go into that cauldron of fire thinking that you're going to sanctify God's name by doing it, and yet a miracle is going to save your life. It's not going to happen. No miracle. When you walk into that furnace, you're going to die. That's what you have to believe. And they went anyhow. Again, being the great leaders that they were, that's what they did. In the end, the miracle did happen. But not because they thought it was going to happen, because if they thought it was going to happen, it wouldn't have happened. They had to believe it wasn't going to happen. And once they believed it wasn't going to happen, then God did it for them, because now they did what they had to do as a function of their own free will, and they sanctified the name of God by doing this, and now the miracle could happen, they could be saved instead. And again, affected a lot of people. So this is a recurring theme all through the Torah, all through Jewish history. We live in a world of passivity. Even amongst the Jewish people, we're taught to develop people to be, to live b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Now, the image of God, God's not passive, not at all. I mean, people mistake his quiet, his patience, for passivity or his absence. No, he's just waiting for our good. He'd like to do something right now. If he could, he'd change everything. I say if he could, because he could do it, but he chooses not to. Why? To give us a chance to use our free will, to give us a chance to take the lead, to take initiative, to not just walk with God. All that's a great level to be on too, especially today in the world of such atheism, agnosticism. Right? If a person to walk with God today in this world, that's a tremendous feat, and certainly l'shevach. It certainly praises the person, absolutely. But that's only halfway there, if that. The full distance. The Vilna Gaon, for example, who lived in the 1700s, died just before the 1800s. He took a proactive approach to redemption. Everybody else had been waiting for Mashiach to come, the Messiah. Come fix up the entire world. What else can we do? How can we possibly bring him? Well, we know you do mitzvahs and commandments and good deeds. It all adds up, 100%. There's no question. And of course, all the asserting, all the suffering that the Jewish people have gone through, and the world too, for that matter. Right, that also helps to purify the world and cause rectification to take place and bring Mashiach. But here we are, 2020, almost 2021, 5781, 5,781 years later, and Mashiach's not here yet. At least he hasn't revealed himself. He probably is here right now. Probably is in the world. Just hasn't revealed himself yet. I saw something this last week, and a commentator, very important, commentary was written, talking about how Mashiach like that. People expect it to be a long, drawn-out process. You have to remember that Moshe himself was walking the face of the earth for 79 years, and no one even knew who he was or what he was capable of achieving until God came down and tapped him on the back and anointed him, appointed him, and said, "You are now the Moshiach. You're the Redeemer now of the Jewish people." And everything changed all of a sudden in 1 year, in one moment. In his 80th year, it all takes place. So the fact that you don't even know who that person is right now doesn't mean he's not here and hasn't been here for a long time already. That we say, Yeshua Hashem Kerafayim. The redemptions of God come in the blinking of an eye. Just like that. You close your eyes, open your eyes, the world's changed. And we've seen that recently too, how quickly things can change. The world, have to adjust itself unexpectedly, almost overnight. Things take time to develop, but they usually take place behind the scenes. History has been about all of that, the entire time. All that's been going on for thousands of years is the development of redemption. It's just taking a long time because God wants us to be involved in the process, and we're going, when he brings it, you can just imagine, we're down here twiddling our thumbs, so to speak, waiting for Mashiach to come, and God's up in Shemaim, Kaviocha, so to speak, twiddling his thumb and saying, when are they going to get involved? When are they going to bring Mashiach already? I can't wait for this to have its happy ending finally, and it's a standoff. Because history was made for us to do something, to leave our mark, to make an impact. That's what you do to draw out your chayim, to draw out your inner soul, your inner light, and bring it into the world. And you become famous too, but that's not why you do it. And you might become rich doing it too, but that's not why you do it. You do it for one very important reason, because that is the truth. So the Vilna Gaon, in his time, based upon the Zohar, recognized that we're entering a period of time called the final generation. Now, that was already a couple hundred years ago, but it's based upon the Zohar. And the Zohar says at the year 5500, which is 1740 at that time, so the age of 20, he took the bull by the horns, so to speak. He became proactive. He began to train his students while he was planning himself to go to Israel. He was on his way to Israel, but for certain reasons, had to turn around and once again, very dejected, very upset about it, but that's what he had to do. And he sent his students instead to begin the repopulation of Eretz Israel. And here we are today, a phenomenal place with about 6-7 million people living in the land. And the shuls have been rebuilt, the desert is blooming because people took a leadership role, and it was costly. The original settlers who came back from Vilna, from Eastern Europe, who traveled all the way to Israel, which in those days was not an easy thing to do and not a safe thing to do, but they got here. And once they got here, it was not a party, no picnic for sure. It was dangerous because of marauders. It was dangerous because of a lack of food. It was dangerous because of disease. But they believed, and they got that inspiration from their master, from their teacher, that they have to take a leadership role. And their names are famous today, at least amongst the people who know the history of how we got to where we are right now. Their names in Yerushalayim and perhaps elsewhere in the country named after these people because they put themselves out on the line, on a limb, to be able to reestablish the Jewish homeland. And it's reestablished because they took that leadership role, and their chelik, their portion in the world to come, is unbelievable because of what they did. We're just living off the all their efforts, and that they laid down the tracks and all that, and here we are a long time later enjoying the fruits of all their labors, much later on. But this is the key point. This is the point that the Torah is trying to instruct us in, that comes out here specifically. I mean, it really is the beginning of the last week's parsha, all the parshas until now, all the parshas Bereshis. I mean, 10 generations come and go. They're barely mentioned. Not even that they gave birth to people. They just, they're not mentioned really at all because they were unimportant. We're talking about 1,656 years of people who literally almost didn't exist at all. Why? Passive, selfish, doing their own thing, no initiative, not trying to fix the world, not trying to change too much. There were a couple, Mesushlach, for example, a couple of people on the way who did something and they helped out a bit, but not enough to bring the world to its final redemption, because that's what history has been waiting for almost 6,000 years now. Just bring the redemption. If Adam Harishon had taken a leadership role and not a passive role, his wife took a leadership role by taking the initiative to eat from the tree, but it was the wrong thing. It was the wrong application of the idea. And when his wife came to him and said to him, "You have to eat too," he should have said, "No, no, because we're not. You shouldn't have. When I got to go talk to God and say, okay, fix this thing up right now." If he had done that, everybody would have remained in the Garden of Eden, and evil would have been destroyed completely by Shabbos, and we'd be all sitting in paradise right now. Redemption. That's what it's supposed to be. He didn't do that. He passively, and if you look at the words of the verse itself, the woman saw, Chava saw, it was Nechma, the 9 less skill. She takes it and she gives it to her husband. Doesn't say even to Adam. Doesn't say even to Adam. There's only two people there right now. And we know who he is. Somebody to say her husband, because her husband comes from someplace else. We haven't met him yet. We just know she's married, right? So he's her husband. But here we know exactly who her husband is. And he's supposed to be a star of the show. But it refers to him as Isha, right? Her Ish, the hey, right? To say her husband. The essence of passivity. And as a result of that, we're kicked out of the Garden of Eden into exile for thousands of years, and here we remain until this very day, waiting for leaders to rise to the top. I mean, even what's going on with the virus and things like that, all the circumstances of history, especially the negative ones, it should happen during the peaceful times too, but certainly the negative ones, they force the issue. And when these things happen, some people retreat and some people rise to the top and become great. They do great things because they're driven not by a need for popularity, not by a need for fame, not even by a need for money or success, but by truth. This is what the world needs. This is what God wants. This is my opportunity to rise to the occasion, to be a Tselem Elokim, living in the image of God and being like God. Because as we learn from Avraham Avinu, it's one thing to talk to God. It's much better to be like him. And that's what Avraham does. And that's what we have to do as well. So, this is an important message. And you have to think about it, take it to heart. Do you only want to be a second on the set and get paid minimum wage? Or do you want to be a star of the show? For the right reasons, not the wrong reasons. And if the latter is true, then check it out. You got to find out what that means and how to apply yourself. Because when a person takes a step in that direction, as the Talmud points out, God will help you. He'll point you in the right direction. You'll meet the right people. Somehow, some way, you'll find out what you could do as a leader to make this world a better place. Good night and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you so much for another wonderful webinar. Again, for those people that are just joining us now, Rabbi Winston's materials and shiurim can be found on his website at 36.org. I would encourage everybody to go there to visit, as well as going to our YouTube channel at Israel Torah, which you can find dozens of lectures, including Rabbi Winston's, over there. We wish everybody Shabbat Shalom